For more than a decade, Ed O'Neill lived as the man everyone loved to hate. To the world, he was Al Bundy, the defeated shoe salesman, the man trapped in a house full of insults and broken dreams. But behind that cynical smirk was a story few fans ever knew, a story of exhaustion, regret, and moments that blurred the line between fiction and reality.
Ed O'Neill finally reveals what most fans never figured out about Married with Children. For 11 seasons, Ed O'Neill stood in front of a live studio audience and let them tear him apart on purpose. He played Al Bundy, a broke, bitter, joke-cracking shoe salesman with a wife he mocked and a life he despised, and somehow, night after night, that pain made people laugh harder than almost anything else on television. What most fans never realized is that the show they thought they knew almost didn't exist in the form they remember. The family that made Married with Children a phenomenon wasn't the family that was originally cast. The controversy that nearly got the show pulled from the air ended up saving it. And the ending, when it finally came, arrived in a way so quiet and so strange that even Ed O'Neill himself didn't believe it until a stranger said it to his face. This is the story fans think they know, told the way it actually happened. When Married with Children filmed its pilot in December of 1986, the Bundy family on screen wasn't the Bundy family the world would come to love. Kelly Bundy was played by an actress named Tina Casberry. Bud Bundy was played by a young actor named Hunter Carson. The scripts were the same. The jokes were the same. But something about the chemistry wasn't working, and the person who noticed it first was Ed O'Neill. O'Neill had been cast as Al Bundy because he understood exactly what kind of performance the role demanded. A man who could be miserable and pathetic and somehow still likable underneath it all. But a family sitcom only works if the family feels real, and O'Neill didn't feel it. According to reporting on the show's early history, it was O'Neill himself who went to the producers after that first pilot and told them the chemistry with the two young actors simply wasn't there. It wasn't a matter of talent. It was a matter of rhythm, the invisible thing that makes a scene either click or fall flat. The producers listened to him. They recast both roles. A 15-year-old actress named Christina Applegate, who already had television experience from shows like Days of Our Lives and Family Ties, stepped into the role of Kelly Bundy. A young actor named David Faustino took over as Bud. Every scene from that unaired pilot had to be res-hot from scratch with the new cast before Married with Children ever reached the public. It's a strange thing to think about now, considering how inseparable Applegate and Faustino became from those characters. Kelly Bundy's ditzy, oblivious charm and Bud Bundy's scheming desperation became two of the most quotable elements of the entire series. But none of it happened by accident, and none of it happened on the first try. The show fans grew up with was built on a decision to start over before it had even started, and the man who pushed for that decision was the actor playing the father at the center of it all. What's easy to miss in that story is what it says about O'Neill's instincts. He wasn't a producer. He wasn't a writer. He was an actor a few years removed from a very different kind of career, and yet he was willing to walk into a room and tell the people in charge that something fundamental needed to change before the show even had a chance to find its footing. That instinct, trusting his gut about what would and wouldn't work in front of an audience, would end up defining his entire relationship with the show for the next decade. Performing for a crowd that could turn on you. Married with Children wasn't filmed the way most sitcoms are filmed today. It was shot in front of a live studio audience, week after week, for the entire run of the series. That meant every joke had to land in real time. There was no laugh track smoothing over the moments that didn't work. If a scene fell flat, the audience's silence filled the room, and everyone on set felt it. This format shaped the show in ways that aren't always obvious from the outside. Physical comedy, which Al Bundy relied on constantly, had to be performed live and repeated across multiple takes until the timing was right. Falls, pratfalls, and slapstick bits that look effortless on screen required real physical effort from a cast that was doing this dozens of times a season, year after year. The show's tone, raunchier and more cynical than almost anything else on network television at the time, also meant that certain jokes landed differently depending on the crowd in the room that night. Some nights the audience roared. Other nights, A joke about Peggy's laziness or Al's misery would draw a more uncomfortable kind of laugh. The sound of a room that wasn't quite sure it was allowed to find something funny. That unpredictability is part of what made the show feel alive, and it's also part of what made it exhausting to produce. A live studio audience adds a layer of pressure that a purely scripted, laugh-tracked show simply doesn't have. Every episode was, in a very real sense, a performance that had to work twice. Once for the cameras and once for the room. Over 11 seasons and more than 250 episodes, that adds up to an enormous amount of physical and emotional wear, carried mostly by the actor asked to be miserable, exhausted, and hilarious on command, week after week, for over a decade. The boycott that almost ended the show and ended up saving it. In January of 1989, a mother from Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, named Terry Ricalta, sat down to watch television with her children. What she saw was an episode called Her Cups Runneth Over, in which Al Bundy and his neighbor Steve go shopping for a bra for Al's wife, Peggy. Ricalta was offended by the content, and rather than simply changing the channel, she decided to do something about it. She wrote letters, dozens of them, directly to the advertisers who bought commercial time during Married with Children, telling them exactly what she thought the show was doing to American families. It worked, at least at first. Several advertisers pulled their spots from the show. Fox, still a young network trying to establish itself against the three major broadcasters, took the backlash seriously enough to shift the show's time slot and lean on the writers to tone down some of the content. Ricalta became a minor media sensation in her own right, appearing on national talk shows and even landing a front-page story in the New York Times about her crusade against what she saw as trash television. For the cast, the experience was disorienting. This was a show built entirely around satire, mocking the very dysfunction it depicted rather than endorsing it. And suddenly its actors were being cast publicly as the villains in a story about the decline of American values. Christina Applegate, still a teenager at the time, found herself at the center of criticism aimed at her character's portrayal, even though she was simply performing lines written by adult writers for an adult audience. But the boycott didn't kill the show. It did the opposite. Curiosity about what exactly had provoked such outrage sent new viewers flocking to Married with Children, in numbers the show had never seen before. Within about a year, nearly every advertiser that had pulled out had quietly returned, and the show's ratings were higher than they'd ever been. What was meant to be a moral crusade against the series ended up functioning as the most effective advertising campaign Fox never had to pay for. The writers, rather than backing away from the show's edge, learned to be sharper and more clever about how they deliver it, leaning into innuendo and wordplay instead of blunt shock value. The controversy didn't just fail to bury Married with Children. It helped turn it into a cultural fixture. The season that was rewritten overnight. Not every story behind the scenes of Married with Children is one of comedy or controversy. One of the most difficult chapters in the show's history involves the sixth season, and it's a story that fans who only know the finished episodes have never fully understood. At the start of that season, Katie Sagal, who played Peggy Bundy, was pregnant in real life. Rather than hide her pregnancy behind furniture and camera angles, the writers made the choice to write it into the show. Peggy became pregnant on screen, and to raise the comedic stakes even further, her on-screen best friend Marcy, played by Amanda Bearse, was written as pregnant at the same time, doubling Al Bundy's on-screen horror at the idea of a growing family he couldn't afford. Then, partway through filming that season, tragedy struck. Sagal's pregnancy ended in a stillbirth, a devastating loss that she has spoken about publicly in the years since. The production had to make an immediate decision. Continuing the pregnancy storyline as written was no longer an option, but there was no way to simply erase 10 episodes worth of story that audiences had already watched unfold. The solution the writers landed on was unusual. An episode in which Al Bundy wakes up and realizes the entire pregnancy arc for both Peggy and Marcy had only been a dream he'd been having all along. It let the show quietly reset the storyline without forcing Sagal to perform scenes tied directly to the loss she had just experienced. It's a strange piece of television history, a beloved sitcom bending its own continuity to protect an actress going through one of the hardest moments of her life. Seagal returned to work and continued playing one of the most iconic characters in sitcom history, and in the years since she has spoken about how the experience shaped her, including through music she later wrote that dealt directly with the loss. It's a reminder that even a show built entirely around jokes was, behind the cameras, made by real people carrying real weight. The man behind Al Bundy. Part of what made Al Bundy work as a character, rather than simply reading as cruel or pathetic, was the way Ed O'Neill approached the role. He understood that the character needed to be miserable without ever losing the audience's sympathy, and that meant there were limits to how far the writing could push him. Al Bundy could be sarcastic, defeated, and endlessly disappointed in his own life. What he couldn't be was mean in a way that made him unlikable, because the moment audiences stopped rooting for him, even reluctantly, the entire premise of the show would collapse. That instinct, the same one that led O'Neill to push for recasting the show's two child actors before the series even premiered, stayed with him for all 11 seasons. He wasn't just playing a character. He was, in a sense, protecting the character, making sure that underneath the insults and the physical comedy, there remained a thread of humanity that let viewers see a piece of themselves in a man whose life had gone nowhere close to where he'd hoped. Looking back, that's arguably the reason Married with Children endured as long as it did, and why it's remembered so fondly decades later. Al Bundy wasn't a role model. He was a mirror, exaggerated for comic effect, held up to anyone who'd ever felt stuck, disappointed, or worn down by ordinary life. The show worked because O'Neill understood that the laughter was only possible if the pain underneath it felt honest. The cancellation nobody called to announce. After 11 seasons, Married with Children had become one of the longest-running sitcoms in American television history, and one of the most influential shows in Fox's early identity as a network. In 1997, without any public farewell tour or final season build-up, it was canceled between seasons. And the way Ed O'Neill found out about it has become one of the most talked-about stories from the show's entire run. O'Neill was back in his hometown of Youngstown, Ohio, staying at a small bed and breakfast during a quiet stretch of time off. On a spring morning, he was outside enjoying the weather when a car pulled up decorated with tin cans and a just married sign trailing behind it. A newlywed couple got out, still dressed in their wedding clothes, and the groom immediately recognized him. "Oh my God, it's Al Bundy in Ohio," he said, and O'Neill laughed and congratulated them. Then the bride said something that stopped him cold. She told him how sorry she was about his show. Confused, O'Neill asked what she meant. The groom, stunned that he didn't already know, explained that it had been on the radio that morning. The show had been canceled. That is genuinely how Ed O'Neill learned that 11 years of his career and one of the defining roles of his life had come to an end. Not from a phone call, not from a network executive, from two strangers on their wedding day who happened to recognize him outside a bed and breakfast in Ohio. He would later joke about the moment, saying he ended up joining the couple for champagne to celebrate their marriage before processing what he'd just been told. He wasn't alone in finding out that way. Christina Applegate has said publicly that she learned about the cancellation secondhand as well, through what she described as a chain of people who eventually passed the news along to her assistant. Neither of the two actors, who had spent over a decade carrying one of Fox's most successful shows, received a direct call from the network telling them it was over. It's a strange, almost absurd way for a major piece of television history to end. And it says something about how disposable even successful shows can feel once the ratings decisions get made in rooms the actors are never invited into. There was no farewell episode built around closure. No on-air goodbye to the audience that had watched Al Bundy suffer through 11 years of manufactured misery. The show simply stopped, and the people who made it found out the way everyone else did, if not later. What Al Bundy became. Years after Married with Children ended, Ed O'Neill found a very different kind of success playing Jay Pritchett on Modern Family. A warm, grounded family man who stood in almost total contrast to everything Al Bundy represented. Where Al was defined by resentment and disappointment, Jay was defined by love, even when he struggled to express it. The two roles, taken together, showed the range O'Neill had always had, but hadn't always gotten a chance to use. That second act also seemed to give O'Neill a new kind of perspective on the role that made him famous in the first place. Al Bundy was never meant to be admired. He was meant to be recognized, an exaggerated stand-in for anyone who had ever felt like life hadn't gone the way they planned, whose humor was really just a way of surviving disappointment without letting it completely win. The joke was never really that Al Bundy's life was funny. The joke was that so many people could see pieces of their own frustrations in it and laugh anyway. Because sometimes laughing is the only sane response to how hard ordinary life can be. Married with Children is remembered today as one of the boldest and most subversive sitcoms of its era, a show that survived a national boycott, weathered a painful production tragedy behind the scenes, and still managed to run for over a decade with a cast that clicked. So while audiences assumed they'd always been together, never knowing that the original family in that pilot looked nothing like the one the world came to love. It's a reminder that the shows people remember as effortless are almost never effortless at all. They're built, torn down, and rebuilt, sometimes just weeks before anyone else ever gets to see them. So the next time you watch Al Bundy grumbling on that couch, remember that the family surrounding him wasn't the one originally cast for the part, that the controversy meant to destroy the show accidentally made it a phenomenon, and that behind the jokes, the cast was carrying real losses that never made it into the credits. That's the story most fans never figured out, and it's a big part of why the show still holds up decades later. What do you think? Could a show like Married with Children survive if it premiered today, or was it truly a product of its time? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the true stories behind television's most unforgettable shows.